Adam Jacob, the creator of Chef and one of the pioneers of infrastructure as code, is back with something new: System Initiative. System Initiative offers real time simulations, digital twins, and collaborative infrastructure management that goes beyond IAC's limitations. Today, we're talking with Adam to understand the technical challenges that led to this evolution and how System Initiative is changing the way engineers approach cloud infrastructure. Today, we're talking with Adam to understand the technical challenges that led to this evolution and how System Initiative is changing the way engineers approach cloud infrastructure. Let's explore what's next for DevOps. And don't forget to hit that subscribe, alert, and like button on YouTube. Also follow GTwGT on all podcast platforms of choice. And now, episode 92 with Adam Jacob, CEO and co-founder of System Initiative. Hey Adam, welcome to the show. So just as a massive fan of automation in general, from my perspective, it's great to have you on. Let's start about your background, because it's super interesting for people that obviously don't know, but they should know. You're the founder of Chef, which is just like godlike status in this industry. And thank you for all the work
Thanks.
that and thank you for all the work that you've done to get that DevOps message out there and automation in general. It's been a great ride to see that. Tell us about your background though. How did you start? Like, it goes far back as you want in terms of your own background in computers and how you got to kind of love
Yeah.
automation.
Yeah. I mean, the TLDR is that I've kind of always been a systems administrator. I still kind of feel like a systems administrator, even though I'm a CEO and was a CTO for a long time at Chef. And that started for me when I was a kid. I found bulletin boards and I thought like running bulletin boards was like the coolest thing in the world, which if you ever ran a bulletin board was essentially systems administration, and I just fell in love with building the infrastructure that let other people talk on the internet. And that's sort of what I've been doing the whole time. And then I fell in love with automation because I kind of grew up in the era where we were building ISPs. And so that history included a lot of consolidation. And so I started building automation to sort of consolidate different ISPs as we came together. So, people I worked for would buy another ISP and we would sort of slurp it up and make it a part of make it a part of our infrastructure and then turn off their infrastructure. And the quicker you could do that, the better off you were.
Interesting.
And then I had another sort of long stint with some folks who did a similar thing, only they were buying applications. And so we had to build sort of generic operating platforms that then we could take applications we weren't around for the writing of and understand them as quickly as we could and then port them to some kind of management system and then figure out how to run them. And so I just fell in love with that problem of how do you automate large infrastructure and how do you automate things in a way that allows people to use it and to sort of get more value.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that's obviously I grew up in service provider land as well. Bulletin boards specifically, I consumed them at that early time of the internet.
Yeah.
I never hosted it, but then as soon as I
Mm.
started working for an ISP, ASP hosting company, getting into the back end stuff, like you realize that you want to try and script things to make your life more efficient, right? That's what IT and computing and tech's all about: efficiency. So if you can double down on that efficiency, it makes your life easier, and that's a really interesting problem to try and solve. I mean,
Yeah. And I just like the meta game of it, you know? Like when you think about how to build a system that like that search for like the right kind of primitive that allows you to like then solve more problems than you could have imagined because you kind of found the right shape of something. Like I
Mhm.
really like that. I like the chasing of that idea,
Yeah.
and sort of
And
always
then,
have.
do you feel kind of good at the end of it, the outcome, because you hit a button
Feels
or
incredible.
you run a script and it's like, bam, and you go, whoa, I did that, but I didn't do that. That's the whole premise of
Yeah.
automation, right? Like, yeah.
Yeah. And it's even better if you build frameworks that other people go use. Like Chef was so fun, but the most incredible part of Chef was that like all these people in all these really ridiculous organizations, brilliant people, found Chef and then used it to do things I couldn't have imagined doing.
Yep.
And that was just like the most gratifying thing in the world. Like and still today, like I'll travel around and people will be like, "Oh, thank you for building that" or whatever, and I'm like, "You did it," Like I like handed you the pieces, and then you made something incredible out of it, and I just, it was so fun to watch. Like it's
Yeah,
so gratifying
absolutely.
to do.
Yeah, and we won't spend too long on Chef, but obviously, given that background, it's interesting to touch on it. I mean, how did you get to the point of? I believe it was the application side of things. We were automating the application acquisitions and whatnot that kind of led to
Mm.
Chef. Initially
Yeah,
back in the
kind of.
2007 area.
Yeah, we had a consulting company, and so we basically sold fully automated infrastructure to startups, so you could like you'd pay us a flat fee and then we would automate everything. So like
Mhm.
monitoring and trending and application deployment and databases and backups and, everything. And the fastest we ever turned a customer on was 24 hours from like you showed us your app to we had a fully running, fully automated
Well,
infrastructure that ran your app in production. And, we were good at it. And the more we scaled both the size of the customers that we serve, but also the number we served, the harder it was. And so that's kind of where Chef came from was we needed a more flexible kind of technology that was also a little more reliable at scale, um, in order to actually serve our own clients. And it turned out that once we built that it was like pretty good,
mhm.
and so we became a product company instead of a consulting company.
Yeah. So you were sort of eating your own dog food slash solving your own internal problems. That's how
Yeah.
great. I believe that's how great companies start. Like I think about say a few like a few of the companies that you hear started from they were a game development company and they build an internal chat for the game and then that actually became
Right.
like a
Slack.
big chat platform. Slack was the one I was trying to think in my head which one it was. I was thinking
Yeah.
TikTok. Which
Yeah.
one was it?
Yeah.
Slack was that
But
example,
in,
right?
But interestingly enough, like the people who were building Slack were people who built enterprise things historically. Like they built Flickr first
That's
and then
it.
they built Slack. And so like
Yeah.
it's an interesting move from Flickr to a video game, but not such a big move from Flickr to Slack.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's right. It is. It's
And yeah, there's
interesting.
something about building things that are the things it's a lot easier to build great. I tend to think of product development as art. And like it's a lot easier to build great art in the art that you know and love as opposed to being like if you're a painter and you decide to go be a sculptor, like there's some crossover between the two, but like
Yeah.
it's a lot easier if you stick to painting.
Yeah, that's really interesting in terms of where innovation kind of drives from. Like if you believe in what you're doing and if you're working around that, like I know some passion projects, right? So if you're building stuff from a point of passion, you're going to put more into it. You're going to be more proud of it, and you're not just building it without soul. I think a lot of companies, a lot of what we're seeing today, specifically with all of the proliferation of startups and all these little tools that come out. If you think about blockchain and what that built, AI, what that kind of created now
Yeah.
a lot of those are built without soul. I think the great
Yeah.
companies and the great innovations are built with soul.
I think it's impossible to build without soul if you actually are trying to build something useful. And in the same way that you can't make great music if it doesn't come from your own heart. You know what I mean? You can play other people's music and you can feel it and that's great. But you can tell that, it's different when
Yeah.
you watch like someone cover someone else versus watching
Yeah.
the actual person play it when you can feel the intonation and the soul that comes out of it. And products are the same. There's a moment where you have to actually fall in love with what you've built and it has to come from you in a way that's authentic and you can't worry too much about how people will react or what they'll think because if you do then you tend to build things that are average. Like if you can ask someone, hey, what do you think I should build? What do you think the answer is to whatever the problem is? And then you tell me, and then I go build it for you, and then I bring it back to you. You very rarely look at that and go, oh, I love it. That was amazing. That blew my mind. Because it didn't blow your mind. It was exactly what you said.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not interesting. It's not better. It's not. You didn't do anything to it. You just heard what someone said and blatted it back out. And like that
Like the
that's
analogy.
that's usually a recipe for failure.
Yeah. I love that analogy. So with that, let's pivot to what we're really here about, which is system initiative and talk about that. And, where
Yeah.
did that come from? Like where was the, chef was that you were doing the chef thing that kind of did its thing.
Mm.
And then system initiative back in 2019. Let's talk about how that came to be initially and the premise for what you're trying to
Yeah.
solve with the company.
Yeah, so I mean, with Chef, I spent a lot of time in a lot of really large organizations and small ones too. Figuring out how to help people sort of do DevOps and do configuration management and sort of think about automation more broadly. And what I saw was that we we could tell people, and there's a path to putting the tools together that does provide really good outcomes. Like there are people who are great at this and they do really well. But most of us don't. The vast majority of us wind up, like the Dora report now, you can be a high performer in DevOps if you can deploy once a week with like a 40% failure rate, I think, something like that, which is insane. If you think
Yeah.
about where we started and what we were trying to do, to be like, you're doing great. You can deploy once a week. Like, that's bananas.
Yeah.
That is not what we set out to do
And fail half the time.
and fail half the time. And like, but we do, but we've moved the needle back because that's how low the bar has gotten. Do you know what I mean? Like when you
Interesting.
survey the world and you're like, how's it going? The answer is kind of mediocre. And to me, what I learned sort of toward the end of my time at Chef was that 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 reason was not because the people who were implementing it weren't smart enough, or because their problems were so complex and intractable. They are complex and they are intractable, but that they couldn't do it. It was instead that like the shape we asked you to work in, the idea that what you would do is like build all your automation by writing code, and then you would check it into source control, and that code would run, and then you'd put it in a pipeline, and we would run infrastructure kind of like we run applications. Like, and then we would start adding in more and more stuff, and we would shift everything to the left. Like that flow, it doesn't work very well. and and when you put that flow into practice, one of the ways you know it doesn't work very well and that it's a system level problem, it's a design problem, is that it still doesn't work very well regardless of the technology changes we put in place, right? Like how many different technologies have we gone through, Docker and Kubernetes and Chef and Puppet and Ansible, and like we can on and on and on. Yeah, how many CD platforms have you tried? And I'm not saying that they're all interchangeable. They're not. They're all some a little bit better than the one before, but the outcomes remain kind of sticky in the end. That's interesting, right? Because if it was a single tooling problem and it wasn't the total flow, you'd imagine that you could improve it dramatically by finding the one thing that sucks and fixing it.
Hmm.
But you can't. And it's because that core primitive at the foundation of it was wrong. And so that was sort of what I had come to believe, in 2018. And my co-founders also believed. And then the question was, what do we do about it? Because it's one thing to look at the way that we work and be like, "Ugh, how we're asking people to work is the problem." And then you're like, well, but what would be better? Because it's not like we came to work that way on accident. You know what I mean? We
Yeah.
built, we made a lot of choices based on really real feedback and really real experience, and so we had to figure out how to do it, and that's what System Initiative is, and that's how it started. Was that question of like, well, how would we do better if we were building a different
Yeah.
experience? If we were going to
How does it
fundamentally
not
alter it,
suck?
what would it be?
Yeah. How
Yeah,
does it not
and how do
suck?
you, and why does it suck now? Like,
Mm.
what about the existing technology can we keep? And what about it can we do we have to get rid of? Like, how deep does the rabbit hole go? Is an interesting,
Okay.
was the interesting question.
Yeah. So if you were to give someone an elevator pitch on what system initiative is at a very sort of high level, what would that be?
Yeah. I mean, system initiative at the highest of levels is the future of how you're going to do DevOps automation. One notch deeper than that, it's essentially a technology that allows us to build like digital twins of digital things. So we basically model everything as data, and then we stick it on this reactive hypergraph of functions. So instead of writing code that describes what you want, instead we gather up all the information about the things that you have, and we allow you to model them in really high fidelity, and then we let you program that model, program that simulation essentially by writing these reactive functions. And then on top of that system, we built a multiplayer user interface that lets us build all kinds of different ways to interact. So if you think about things like Unity, for example, which is a similar kind of complexity. If you think about the complexity to go build like Grand Theft Auto, or the complexity to build like a big multiplayer MMO, the number of different disciplines required to create that are roughly on par with the kinds of disciplines that are necessary to run a huge enterprise. And if you look at how they work together, they do not work like we do. Like they do not push all of the all of the digital art designers to the left and be like write code to describe. You know what I mean? They give you a UI that you use for a
Yeah.
particular job. And then what you're doing is working on the data together to create the outcome. The same thing happens in movies and all kinds of things. And
Mhm.
so essentially, that's what System Initiative does for not today for infrastructure, but eventually for kind of all of DevOps.
Yeah. So, I mean, what's interesting there is that, you talked about what did you call it? The graphical sort of element of all the workspace that you guys have got where you do all the work and all the dragging and dropping. Is that
Yeah, we call it like a living architecture diagram.
leaving
Um,
architecture diagram?
yeah, I mean that's sort of the interface that you use when you think about, if you have this big underlying this system is this really powerful hypergraph of functions, programming that hypergraph of functions without some interface is annoying. And so the that living architecture diagram is a way of saying, hey, I have these really high fidelity components that have a bunch of intelligence built into them. How do I link them together? And so you link them together by specifying these relationships between them, which is
Mhm.
really just passing data into each function, right?
Yeah.
So you're essentially programming this big simulation by using this living architecture diagram.
Yeah, you're talking simulation, digital twins, like multiplayer gaming. It's a fascinating concept. The thing that I go
Hmm.
to straight away when we think about DevOps world and what the mindset of those people are is that they're so anti UI, so anti interface. It's
Yeah.
all a bit about code. It's all about
Hmm.
getting rid of that because that's the old way of doing it.
Yeah.
And now
And
you're
look, I
kind
spent
of
most of my
going, and
career doing that.
yeah, and you're kind of
Yeah.
going, You know what? Let's go back to something that's not quite that, and let's use some
Well,
sort of graphical interface to kind of go through it. Which the hypergraph
yeah.
situation, which is interesting.
Yeah. I mean, look, I'm as surprised as anyone. So, like if you were hanging out with me when we were talking about whether this was what we should do, I was like, this will not work. This is a dumb idea. And it turned out that it did work and it wasn't dumb. And and the reason is because look, most of the time in our space, we have a good reason to have an aversion to these sorts of tools. They tend to be toys, right? Historically,
Always.
that's what they are. Like they don't scale in complexity. They aren't useful over a long period of time. They don't work well with multiple people. You can't keep track of them. You can't use them in the enterprise. You don't get audit logs. Like there's a million reasons why those tools haven't worked in the past. It turns out that that's also because those tools lacked a fundamental primitive that allowed you to actually think about modeling the domain in a way that makes any sense at all. And so, if you're trying to build a visual tool that sits on top of arbitrary source code, it turns out that doesn't work very well, right? People forgot like 4GL and some of those things from back in the day where, there was a minute in the industry where everybody was convinced we were going to use UML, and then UML was going to like generate the code for us automatically from the diagrams. And it's going to be amazing.
Uh-huh.
It didn't work very well because you wanted to customize the code all the time, right? And so we wound up not doing it because it turned out not to be flexible enough. Like that's what the history of infrastructure tools are in this space too, right?
Mm.
If they start from the position of simplicity, if it's like, oh, I'm going to simplify this complex problem, well, then they don't turn out to be powerful enough. And infrastructure is a domain that requires essentially infinite power. And so part of what makes System Initiative great is that it doesn't give up any of that power. Like because of the nature of the domain, the nature of infrastructure allows
Yeah.
us to build these digital twins and to model things in this way. And then we put the code back into it by saying what you program is the simulation. And that's the thing that's a bit of a head trip because, when you think about it, you're like, okay, oof, if you shake it off a little, it kind of starts to make sense. But it's a big jump.
Yeah, and the concept of toys versus tooling is really interesting. I think about I would get super excited if I had a new toy, which was a tool to try and do something better in my daily line of work, right? But we would the amount of things you would sign up for because this was going to be the next thing, and then that is a toy, right? By definition in our world,
Mm,
because we want to
yeah,
play with it, we want to see what it does, we want
sure.
to have fun with it, we want to see if it makes us
Yeah,
feel good. So
yeah,
I get that analogy. It's really interesting. Talk about the living architecture and digital twin component of it, because I find that it's all about the modeling, right? So talk a
yeah.
little bit about that and how that is so fundamentally, like you said, like shifting for the mind.
Yeah. So think about it this way. So, when you build an application, right? So we sit down, we write some application code. Like what tends to happen with it is it gets like compiled into an artifact. The artifact sometimes gets deployed, it gets put on things, it gets put in container, it goes and runs somewhere. But like we kind of know what the flow is that we're going to do here, right? And that flow is pretty sticky, kind of regardless of the application that you're writing. Infrastructure, on the other hand, like is not. Like infrastructure, things happen to infrastructure that you don't want to have happen, right? Data centers catch on. It's physical things. They catch on fire. They they disappear. People will change them. Like all kinds of state happens to infrastructure because it tends to represent physical things. Even in the cloud, right? Even the digital parts are not they're not as they don't work like you think that they do. And so part of what we do is we took lessons from the real world again. And how do people deal with, for example, a really difficult problem in our space is feedback loops. Think about how long it takes to know if you have a lot of Terraform. Let's say you have a reasonably large Terraform repository. How long does it take to run a plan? And how long does it take to like run the apply? Those numbers can get up high really fast, right? Tens of minutes, 20 minutes,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And the feedback loop to know if you've done something right or wrong, it's a little like driving a submarine, Like You can tell, but it's a little tough. And so
I'm
the way
laughing because
people
I
solve
get. I'm
this,
laughing because I get this. I'm laughing because I get this. I know the
yeah,
pain, but
because you're there.
continue. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So think about it. Like, how do people solve this in the outside world? So like, let's use Formula One cars as an example. So Formula One cars, very complicated, incredibly difficult things, and they get a very limited amount of testing. Right? You can only put them on track a very small amount of time. And so what they do to solve this problem is is they build a simulator. They build a really high fidelity simulator of the car. And they run the car over and over and over again in this simulator with all the different setups and mechanisms they could possibly try, so that by the time they get to the track, they only try the ones that are most promising, right? And what they're doing is building a digital twin of the car, right? We see the same thing with like miners, right? We tend to send robots now to the bottom of deep mines. We don't send people. And those robots, there's a digital twin of the robot up top where somebody is controlling all the different pieces and all the different
Mhm.
inputs, and we're combining the sensors in the real world with the feedback loop at the station where they're controlling it, and like and so we do the same thing only for infrastructure, right? So we build these really high fidelity models that are one to one to the upstream. So if AWS describes their API in a particular way, we model that API one to one, right? We're not building like an abstraction or a declaration. And then we program that with functions, right? So you construct that high fidelity model in this way. The advantage of doing that is that we can track both sides, right? I can track what you say you want, and I can track what it actually is in the real world, and I can do them separately. And then I can visualize both of those things for you. So I can say, hey, the real world changed. And you can be like, yeah, that's right, because there was an outage, and I just went to the AWS console and fixed it because I wasn't sure how to do it in Terraform. And so in System Initiative, that's no big deal. You would just see that there's a delta and you would update the component, and then that'd be it. You just, because you don't really care where the state came from. What you care about is that it's been managed, right? You care that it's been understood. You care that you can see the delta and the drift.
Yeah, and I think from a visualization point of view, people should probably go and check out the website to get an understanding of, you've got some great demos on there that shows the interface and what you mean
Yeah.
by, things not being right. You've got indicators as black and white as red and green, right? In terms of what's going on, is something
Yeah.
configured. You drop elements into the main sort of flow there. The elements are AWS at the moment. We'll talk about why it's
Yeah.
AWS and
Components. Yeah.
what's going through. So EC2
Mm.
instance, you've got a VPC, you've got a gateway,
Right.
API gateway, and you're kind of connecting them yourself in this very sort of real sort of way. Much like
Yeah.
it almost reminds me of like the old database table days. We're trying to link
Yeah.
databases and keys and whatnot. That's kind of how it looks like to me,
Yeah.
anyway.
Depending
But
on
you're
how
doing it
old
for
you are,
infrastructure.
it has a
Yeah.
vibe like, depending on how old you are, it has a vibe kind of like almost like Visual Basic.
Yes.
Or sometimes it almost gives you a vibe like small talk if
Uh-huh.
you're really old. But like, yeah, it's like all of those things were inspirational in thinking about what was possible, and it turned out to be a really good fit. And like I said, I'm as surprised as anyone because,
Yeah.
like I made my living building declarative code and telling everyone that that was the way. And
Yeah.
look, I'm proud of what we did. We weren't wrong. Like
No.
the current, the state of the status quo is much better than it was 15 years ago. So
Yeah.
I'm proud of it. But we can do an order of magnitude better.
Yeah, and I think to be fair, like you also expose that element still within it, right? Like people can see that the JSON configuration, they can see the actual
Yeah.
code that's running. So it's not like you're abstracting that completely and hiding it, which I think it fits for
Yeah.
both worlds, right? And you
In
kind of are
yeah.
making people happy at
In
both ends of it.
in many ways, we're actually exposing more of the code. So like one of the things that happens here is like if you think about how like Terraform or Chef or Puppet or Kubernetes is built, like you have this interface that you can see. So in Kubernetes, you have the YAML. But then there's all the code that runs the CRD that actually reconciles that thing and manages its lifecycle. In System Initiative, those things are reactive functions that are also part of the graph that you can change in real time. So like you can just open up the way that a particular, if you like, for example, we had a user who needed to use the Mac features of EC2, and we
I saw
hadn't
that. Yeah.
quite, and we hadn't modeled it correctly. And so he fixed it. He just opened up the assets we shipped by clicking a button, which opened up all the source code and then changed it. And then there's a little button you push that contributes it back. And he hit that button and we like took it in and vetted it. And then we shipped it to everyone. Now we have Mac support.
Hmm.
And he didn't have to he didn't have to go fork a provider in GitHub to do that. He just looked at the source code that was
That's
running in
interesting.
his local graph, changed it, saw that it worked, and then said, now I would like to share this with everyone else. And we did it. And like, that's because what you're doing, there's plenty of code, but what the code is doing is programming how the simulator works.
Really cool. Yeah. So talk about the multiplayer aspect of it and the slight gamification. Is it a gamification element or is it more multiplayer in a different sense?
I mean, it is kind of gamification. I didn't necessarily think of it as gamification, but yeah, if you've used Notion or you used Figma or you've used Google Docs, then you know what we mean when we say multiplayer collaboration. Like it basically it happens in real time. So if you and I were to log into the same system initiative workspace right now,
Hmm.
and we were in the same change set, which is basically like a branch. So, but it's a branch of everything, both the source code and all the properties, and it's where you can change the simulation safely, basically, without having any impact in the real world. Um, then what would happen is we would see each other's changes happen in real time. Like you'd see my cursor, you'd see me drop things in the diagram, I'd
Wow.
see the
Okay.
things that
Yep.
you add appear, and we could change each other. So like it really changes things like review. If you think about code review right now, you write a bunch of code and send someone a diff. In System Initiative, you invite them into a change set, and they can like look at everything you did, and they can see it. And if they want to change it, they can just make changes. And then when you come back, you can see what they did, and all those things are represented to you in this diagram, and you can have a full audit history of everything you've done. But like the big transition for me, like I had forgotten what it felt like to do that kind of work in real time with other people. Like the last time I remember doing that kind of work that way was like building an ISP with one of my best friends and sitting around building System Initiative with System Initiative with, watching our team do it. I was emotional about it. I was a little moved because I forgot how much I wanted to do that. Like I forgot how much this was actually like it was actually it's always kind of been a thing that you do with other people because no single person really has enough knowledge to pull it off. And that was kind of the core thing that DevOps realized from the beginning. And only we lost it, kind of in code review and pipelines and incredibly long
Yeah.
feedback loops and like now it's back. And
I-
like
I'm feeling
I
you there.
honestly I feel a little emotional about it because I'm like I
Yeah.
missed it, I miss
Yeah.
those people.
And I think about, I've been 8 years out of a data center, right? And now, but I spent the first portion of my career always in data centers
Yeah,
building, getting the smell of that new tin
right?
and putting it together and then
Yeah.
installing and then, but you're right, it was never a single thing. Whenever you
No.
did that, whenever you deployed a new DC, whenever you got new kit, it was a group effort, team effort.
Hmm.
And it felt good doing that.
It felt good.
I'm really like
And I really
you've tapped into
and
something there.
I didn't know I missed it. I
Mm.
didn't know, you
Yeah.
know, like, but I did. And now that I have it back again in this very different way, it's not the same as being in a data center, but it is the same as like, as interacting with other human beings again. And when you think about it in terms of expertise, like another good example was somebody popped in our Discord today and they were trying to figure out how to use Lambda. And they'd never used the details of Lambda. They'd only like sort of used the high level things. And so they were trying to figure out like how the IAM rules would work for the role for the Lambda they needed to use. And one of the things we offered to do was like, if you want us to, we can just hop into your workspace and like one of the folks on our team who understands Lambda really well could just show you what to do and like literally do it. And then you could like watch
Yeah.
it pop into the change set together and see if it was good. And that's wild, you know? It's crazy how much
That
better
that
it
is
is.
that is great. That's getting back to that feel, like you said. I really enjoy that point. Talk about the 200% problem, because that's something that is
Yeah.
I found interesting as well.
Yeah. So I first understood this problem with Chef. So, when we first built Chef was configuration management, right? And so the thing everybody used when we built Chef was Apache 2. Do you remember Apache 2, the web server?
Hmm. Yeah.
Or Nginx if
Yeah.
you're not cool enough to
Bit more
remember
modern.
Apache.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yep. Yep.
but
Apache all
um,
the way.
I mean, I've been using Nginx for a while, but anyway, the problem. So the thesis here was always that you would have a single incredible cookbook or module or whatever, and what it would do is cover all the functionality of the underlying thing that it automated, so nobody would ever have to write it ever again. We were like, one person will just automate Nginx, one person will automate VPCs, and then nobody ever has to build a VPC by hand ever again. They get it done correctly because you're driving this higher level abstraction. And it turned out that was dumb because what happens is You have to use it, you have to know 100% of the capabilities of the thing you want to automate and 100% of the abstraction that whoever automated it for you put on top of it in order to let you do whatever it is that the thing you understand can do. And in fact, you in any given moment probably need 5% of all of the possible things you could configure, and you know exactly what they are. You're like, hey, I know how to write the Nginx config. Now the question is, how do I map it to this crazy thing you gave me? And so if what you gave me, and you see this in like a Terraform module, if you ever grabbed a Terraform module that has like, or a Helm chart that has like 900 variables in it,
Yeah.
and you're like, oh my God, which variable do what do I do? And what you're doing is then mapping those variables back to the documentation of the thing that it's automating for you. And
Yeah.
so, like, did it actually make it better for you or make it worse? And what we learned in the chef community was it was worse. That actually, if you just built your own cookbook to manage Nginx that only did exactly what your application needs, it was easier for you to write. It was easier for you to maintain. It was easier for people to understand. Like it was better. And so we just stopped trying to have like big community cookbooks that just did everything for you because it was worse. In fact, little less was more. And what happened in System Initiative was we discovered that that 200% problem is inherent in that moment of abstraction, that thing where we map how the underlying system works to like the declarative paradigm is really the source of that 200% problem because I have to map every option to to a declaration and it's not usually declarative. And even when it is, it's a little weirdly sticky. And so you kind of need to just model the system as it is to avoid the problem.
Yeah. It's almost like the premise of trying to create less work through efficiency actually creates more work.
Yeah, it happens in particular when you're trying to do it at scale. When you're saying this abstraction will replace this thing with equal amounts of power, which is usually what happens. And so that's why and it happens, you can see it in every module store, right? Like go look at a Helm chart that automates Postgres and it'll have 9,000 tunables because Postgres has 9,000 tunables and
Yes, yes,
and
yes.
everybody needs one of them, you know? And
Yeah.
then, it becomes combinatorically weird. And System Initiative avoids this problem by saying, let's not abstract them at all. Let's just model them one to one and then let higher level semantics drive their behavior. So, imagine having a component that configures Postgres, but not because it abstracts Postgres, but because it understands Postgres and it knows how to tweak the variables for you and you can watch it happen. And so, a similar example here is like, let's say you have a template in most things where you fill out a template and then it goes and does some stuff for you. You can't usually then edit the results of the template, right? Not if you want to keep using the template. Because if you change it, then now suddenly I have to grow the template and I have to do all that stuff. That's the 200% problem in action. Whereas like if you can just model everything one to one, and then let higher level semantics drive their behavior, which is pretty natural to do in a graph with reactive functions, right? Because the answer is just, okay, well, that property is set because this other property over here sets it. And then whenever this one changes, we should react by changing the value.
Yeah, interesting. Hey, quickly, not a lot of time left, but let's talk about the open source aspect of this. It's on GitHub. You talked
Yeah.
about a semi-community contribution with the Mac thing. I guess that's kind of an
Mm.
example of that, but
Yeah.
maybe more of a feature of what you guys have done there. But open source became problematic this year because of what happened with Terraform, I think, and that sort of thing. And people started to question the legality of it. We had the WordPress thing a couple of weeks ago as well. That
Yeah.
kind of caused
Yeah.
issues. What's your general take on this, and why have you decided to kind of go down this path?
Well, look, there's two very different parts of me in open source, and we could spend 40 minutes
Do it
easily
like in two.
just
Do it in
talking.
two.
Just it's hard for me to do in two, but I'm going to do my very best. But look, the short version from a business point of view is this is transformational technology, and so today, a very small number of people in the world are going to really understand what it is and understand the implications. And, I'm on this podcast because I'm hunting for those people. I'm hunting for that 2.5% who are going to hear what I say and they're going to be like, oh, yes. What if it was a reactive graph of functions? And what if we
Mhm.
did think about it as a data transformation across it? And what I can't do is cap those people's upside. I can't also say to them, hey, I have this transformational technology for you, but you can only have it if I'm the only one who gets to benefit exactly the way that I think I should. Instead, I have to say, look, this is going to change your life. I don't know how. I don't know what you're gonna do with it. But if you can use it to change your life the way I'm using it to change mine, then we're both gonna be better for it, and we're both gonna thrive, and my business is gonna be bigger, and whatever you decide to do with it'll be better. And if we can figure out how to do that together as a community, there's no question we can do more together than we could do alone. Um, and
Get it.
you know, it's more complicated for my business because you know, I have to think through a lot of those edge conditions about, well, how am I going to relate if somebody does something I don't want them to do? And the answer is I'm just going to tell them to fork it. You know, like I have to be comfortable with a lot of those decisions, but I'm very
Mm,
comfortable with them because I
yeah,
believe that we can be a good steward of that upstream in a way that allows everyone to thrive because it is transformational technology,
yeah,
and that's the best way to bring transformational technology into the industry. If you don't open source it, it won't live up to its potential.
yeah. And I think that ties back to what you talked about developing and creating stuff with soul and purpose as well.
Hmm.
I tie those two things together, what you just talked about, right? That
Yeah,
journey. So
because
that's a
it's not.
really good
Yes, exactly.
validation of it.
I didn't design it to not change you. I
Yeah,
designed it to like what I want it to do, what it's built to do, is change how this whole industry functions at like a primitive technical level. And if that's what
love
it's
it.
going to do, like it has to be open source.
Awesome. Hey, just a little bit of futures. We've got like 2 or 3 minutes left. So obviously at the
Yeah,
moment, AWS is the focus.
yeah,
Obviously, I can see why that is. Huge sort of addressable market.
yeah.
Where do you see it going? Like, what's the plans for System Initiative like in the near term, and then where do you want this to be in sort of 12 to 18 months?
Yeah. So I mean, a lot of what we're doing right now is adding sort of broader capabilities. So, you know, things like really deep like Reebok systems for access control and policy, adding more asset coverage, like you said, adding in like really comprehensive audit logs. They're already there, but sort of exposing them in a better way. You know, doing having more ways to sort of cope with the visual complexity. You know, it's really what we've done with the living architecture diagram is really cool, but it's a bit like staring at the sun right now because it's like a huge infinite canvas, which is on the one hand amazing because you've probably never seen what your entire SaaS environment looks like, your whole production environment looks like all at once. But also when you can see it all at once, it's kind of overwhelming. So like some of that's going to happen. The big thing that's going to happen in the next 12 to 18 months is that we're going to learn together with the people who use the software exactly what they need to be most successful, and then it's going to really go nuts. You know, like as soon as what's happening is we're learning in collaboration with real people with real problems, and we're like figuring out how to overcome those things using this primitive together. That's how it's going to really grow, and turn into what it can be. So I'm really looking forward to that loop because that symbiotic loop between, okay, here's this really great primitive we've built, now people go use it, then they come back and tell us how it was, and then we react to that, and then we talk to them some more, and then we build some more, and then they react and we build, and you know, you just
Yeah.
sort of spider your way to greatness.
Yeah. Do you see it, and just very quickly, do you see it extending out to say on premises sort of
Yeah.
environments, workloads, maybe even desktop, like a local? So if I've got my Mac Mini, I've got a little dev environment here doing its thing. Like, you know, do you see it kind of extending there at a time?
You can model anything. So yeah, I think it's going to go where people want it to go, you know? And like VMware, for example, I think System Initiative could very quickly be a better interface to VMware than VMware by a lot. Like if you think about that living architecture diagram and the things you have to
Yeah.
manage in VMware, like let's go, you know? Like
That's
this is
needed. Yeah,
this is
and
going to be
VMware
better.
VMware need a boost as well. Just so you know what, I reckon go
They
do
could
it.
use a hug,
They could
you
use a
know?
hug for sure.
And so you know, like, but I think so. Yeah, I think all of that's coming, and what we have to what we have to do together as a community of people is like we have to learn how to do that. We have to learn like, well, where are the sweetest spots? Because it is a new technology, you know, and any new technology, you got to figure out like, okay, what is it and how does it work and where does it fit and
Awesome.
how can I play? And you got to play with it and make it go. So
Awesome. Well, I would encourage people to get onto the System Initiative website, have a look at the videos, actually go in and play. You've got a free tier as well, I think, from a
yeah,
certain
really,
level.
yep,
So that's
pretty
really
big.
great. So I've even gone and played with it already. So I'm just getting my head around it. But yeah, this has been an amazing look. I really love what you've done here. And I think more people should go check out System Initiative. So thank you very much for being on episode 92 of Great Things with Great Tech.
92. Nice
Yeah,
work.
getting to the
Hell yeah,
100.
92.
Nearly there.
Yeah, incredible.
Awesome.
Thank you for
Awesome.
having me.
No worries. Hey, just as a reminder, thanks for listening to this episode. Stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to highlight companies and technologies shaping our world. Don't forget to follow us on social media at GTwGT Podcast and visit gtwgt.com for more great content and all past episodes. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and on YouTube. Please spread the word, and if you feel like it, drop a review. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Great Things with Great Tech.